He once joked that Prince came to find me in a crazy way, but when Chaka talks about him, the tone changes. The laughter fades. We were very, very close spiritually, she says, and the word spiritually hangs heavier than the rest. Their connection wasn't just about music. It was about what he was running from and what he believed was chasing him. After Prince began turning his back on the church, the people around him started noticing details that didn't look like gossip. They looked like patterns. Friends said his personality shifted fast almost overnight. He grew withdrawn, suspicious, physically fragile. Behind closed doors, collapses and crises started to stack up in private, with no tabloid headlines to mark them. According to Chaka Khan, Prince didn't simply walk away from faith. He stepped into a spiritual no-man's land. In that space, guilt, fear, and pain didn't disappear. They followed him more closely. He wasn't free. He was exposed. Relationships began to crack. His body started to fail him. And for a man who had resisted modern medicine for years, he slowly became dependent on prescription drugs just to make it through the day. The people who loved him most started asking a question no one wanted to write down. Was something out there punishing Prince, or was he slowly destroying himself after cutting loose the spiritual anchor that once held him together? Chaka Khan would later say that what Prince endured in those final years wasn't liberation at all. It was torment, something she believed felt worse than death. This documentary opens the file on the chain of events that followed Prince's break with the church, and why some people close to him now believe the price he paid was never meant to be survived. Prince, the Church, and the Conflict 1960 S1980s. Prince Rogers Nelson was born into sound and contradiction. Growing up in Minneapolis, his childhood home was shaped by music and faith at the same time. Church language surrounded him, early gospel harmonies, strict moral rules, warnings about sin and salvation. God was presented as comfort but also as judge. Inside that same house there was turbulence. His parents' relationship was unstable. Voices were raised, doors closed hard. For young Prince, devotion and chaos existed in the same small rooms. The message was confusing love and conflict, holiness and hurt, all living under one roof. That tension never left him. It turned into fuel. From the beginning, people remember a boy with a restless inner world, disciplined, intensely private, almost painfully sensitive to judgment. Music gave him what real life did not control. Notes obeyed him. Arrangements responded to his choices. In a studio, even a tiny one, he could shape reality with his hands. Faith felt different. Organized religion came with rules that seemed rigid and unforgiving. There were things you could feel but not act on, questions you weren't supposed to ask, desires you were expected to deny. Even as a teenager, Prince was already being pulled in three directions at once: belief, desire, and freedom. He wanted God. He wanted sex. He wanted creative freedom that didn't require permission. Trying to reconcile those forces would become the central struggle of his life. When Prince broke into the mainstream in the late 1970s and exploded in the 1980s, that inner conflict stopped being private. It became part of the show. Albums like Dirty Mind 1999 and Purple Rain didn't just hint at sexuality, they built entire worlds around it. Prince sang bluntly about lust, pleasure, and temptation with a clarity that stunned America. On stage, he blurred gender lines, rejected modesty, and offered no apology. High heels, lace, bare skin, and a gaze that refused to look away first. For many fans, especially young black listeners, it felt like a jailbreak. Someone had finally said out loud what they had been told to hide. For others, especially conservative religious communities, it looked like an attack. By the mid-1980s, Prince wasn't just a pop star. He had become a symbol, and symbols attract judgment. Church leaders called him out from pulpits. Sermons used his lyrics as evidence that culture was rotting. Call-in shows debated whether his songs were poisoning youth. Editorials warned that black music had lost its way. He was painted as proof that sin could be glamorous. a dangerous influence, a corrupter. And it wasn't whispered. It was shouted loudly, repeatedly in public. What made that judgment cut so deeply was simple. Prince did not see himself as an enemy of God. According to people close to him, he believed in a higher power with absolute seriousness. He prayed. He wrestled. He searched. The problem wasn't belief. The problem was guilt. Chaka Khan has said that during these years, Prince lived with a constant, unresolved moral conflict. He loved the church's promise of grace, but he could not silence his desire. The more he was condemned, the sharper that conflict became. It didn't push him away from God. It pushed him away from peace. His music from this era made that conflict impossible to ignore. Right next to explicit sexuality, he layered heavy religious imagery, angels, and judgment, salvation, and temptation. Pleasure sat side by side with warning. Ecstasy collided with fear. He wasn't casually mocking faith. He was circling around it, arguing with it, daring it to answer him. To some listeners that sounded like blasphemy. To others, it sounded like confession. Institutions, however, are rarely patient with confession. As Prince's fame grew, the spotlight grew harsher. Music videos were attacked for indecency. Protests targeted his concerts. Parents groups lumped him together with artists they accused of dragging teenagers away from God and morality. The accusation hardened Prince was enjoying sin without consequences. And he heard every word. Friends say he did not roll his eyes and brush off the criticism. He absorbed it. He didn't always respond. He internalized. It sank in deep where no one else could see it. That unresolved guilt, caught between faith and desire, heaven and stage lights, didn't fade as his career climbed. It intensified, setting the stage for a break that would change everything: his turn away from the church and the spiritual fallout that followed. Turning against the church. Prince never held a press conference to announce that he was done with the church. There was no dramatic interview, no shouted declaration. His break didn't happen in one loud moment. It happened in fragments, quiet refusals, subtle changes, doors that stopped opening. By the early 1990s, the people closest to him could see it clearly. His relationship with organized religion had hardened into something closer to open resistance. The guilt that once powered his internal struggle no longer felt like something he wanted to resolve. Instead of trying to reconcile faith and desire, Prince began pushing back. Not against God, according to those around him, but against the institutions he believed were using God as a weapon. Friends and collaborators from that period recall a shift in how he spoke about religion. He started naming things that had once gone unspoken, how religious authority had shaped his shame, how sermons and criticism had taught him to be suspicious of his own body, his own wants, his own creative instincts. He began asking pointed questions. Why is desire automatically labeled sin? Why does creativity require repentance? Why does faith demand submission instead of understanding? Over time, the church in his mind stopped looking like a sanctuary and started looking like surveillance. People around him say he came to believe that institutional religion thrived on fear and guilt, especially for black artists. Fear of punishment, fear of being cast out, fear of losing community. He watched how that fear followed him into interviews, into reviews, into conversations with fans who felt entitled to judge not just his music, but his soul. For the first time, Prince refused to play that role. He began rejecting the idea that anyone had the right to morally supervise him. He wouldn't soften lyrics to keep religious critics calm. He wouldn't clean up imagery just so certain audiences could pretend not to be offended. He bristled when interviewers tried to pull spiritual approval out of him on command. In private, he reportedly described the church not as a place of healing, but as a system that often confused control with holiness. That realization did not soothe him. It sharpened him. He grew defensive, less trusting. The religious fans who had once defended him as flawed but faithful began to step back. Some called him arrogant. Others insisted he had turned his back on God entirely. Communities that had once claimed him now spoke about him as a warning, an example of what happens when you go too far. The language changed faster than most people realized, from concern to condemnation, from support to distance. Prince felt that shift. Relationships began to fracture. Invitations that once arrived automatically started to slow. Calls took longer to be returned. Some never were. Prince started shrinking his circle, convinced that many people around him were no longer listening, only evaluating. Insiders say he began keeping a mental list of who could be trusted and who could not. This wasn't wild paranoia. It was disappointment hardened into self-protection. That tension bled into his work. Collaborations stalled. Creative partnerships ended abruptly with no public explanation. Prince became fiercely private about his process, locking down studios, restricting access to rehearsals, limiting who could see works in progress. Where he once thrived on constant exchange, he now demanded control. Total control. Friends described him as guarded and withdrawn, but also restless, like a man pacing inside his own thoughts. He was no longer trying to make peace between faith and desire. He was trying to escape the shame he believed faith had planted there in the first place. And that escape came with its own cost. As he pulled away from the church, he did not land in peace. He landed in silence. Questions about morality, forgiveness, and whether he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed didn't disappear. They lost their framework. The church had once given him answers, even if those answers hurt. Now there were no answers at all, just a quiet that grew louder the longer he sat in it. Those closest to him say that during this period Prince became hyper-aware of judgment, even when no one spoke it. He would replay conversations, second-guess motives, assume criticism in comments that weren't meant that way. What started as sensitivity hardened into mistrust. People he used to confide in found themselves held at arm's length. By the mid-1990s, insiders weren't whispering about scandal. They weren't talking about tabloids or headlines. They were talking about change. Something in Prince's energy had shifted. He was less playful, less spontaneous, more rigid. The brilliance was still there, undeniable, blinding, but now it seemed wrapped in tension like light trapped behind glass. This is the period when a single word quietly began to appear in private conversations about him: curse. Not as a literal supernatural force, as a metaphor. People didn't mean demons. They meant consequences. They were trying to describe a man who had cut loose a painful bond, but never found anything to replace it. A man who walked away from the judgment of the church, only to discover how deeply that judgment had shaped him. According to Chaka, this was when Prince stopped arguing with the institution and started turning that argument inward. The freedom he thought might be waiting for him didn't arrive. Isolation did. And for someone as sensitive as Prince, isolation was not neutral. It was dangerous. The consequences didn't crash down on Prince all at once. They arrived slowly in pieces through private collapse, physical pain, and choices that quietly contradicted everything he once said he believed. By the late 1990s, the shift in his life was no longer just philosophical. It was visible. People who spent time around him say you could feel it before he even spoke. The air in the room changed. There was less laughter, more rules, longer pauses. The man who once fed on intimacy, spontaneity, and endless collaboration now moved through his own space like someone patrolling a perimeter. The first fractures showed up at home. Prince's marriage began to strain under pressure that never fully reached the public. Friends remember arguments about boundaries, about control, about trust fights that ended without resolution. The relationship grew brittle, then distant. When it finally broke, it did so quietly. No loud headlines, no public spectacle. But inside his world, the fallout was devastating. He pulled back even further. Around this time, whispers began circulating, not tabloid stories, but insider murmurs. Short-lived connections. Intense attachments that ended abruptly. People who saw these patterns describe a man searching for comfort while being terrified of judgment. He wanted closeness without exposure, love without vulnerability. That balance never lasted. As relationships failed, Prince's need for control hardened. People inside his circle say strict rules appeared: who could visit, when they could speak, what subjects were off limits, how they had to move inside his space. Guests at Paisley Park described an atmosphere where spontaneity disappeared. Doors stayed shut. Cameras vanished. Conversations felt monitored. Some collaborators stopped calling. Others were quietly moved out of his orbit. From the outside, it looked like arrogance. From the inside, it looked like fear. The rumors of extreme isolation weren't exaggerated. By the early 2000s, Prince spent long stretches technically surrounded by staff, but emotionally alone. Meals were brief. Conversations stayed businesslike. Vulnerability was rare, and when it appeared, it closed just as fast. People who tried to reach him say he would listen politely, nod, and then retreat. Trust was rationed. Affection came with conditions, and then came the hit that destroyed whatever fragile balance remained. In October 1996, Prince and his wife lost their infant son shortly after birth due to a rare genetic condition. The outside world barely registered it. There were no endless panels, no nightly specials. But privately, the impact was immense. Friends say Prince was shattered in a way he never put into words. He did not grieve loudly. He folded the grief inward. He looked for meaning and found none that soothed him. According to Chaka, this was the moment when something dark settled in for good. Prince did not start speaking in dramatic, apocalyptic language. He did something quieter. He kept circling the same idea: payment. He wondered aloud whether he was paying for his past, whether his choices, his defiance, his break from religious authority had finally come due. This is where the word curse began to crystallize, not as talk of demons or superstition, but as a way to describe consequences he believed he could not escape. People close to him insist he didn't talk about being haunted by some supernatural force. He talked about guilt, about reckoning, about the fear that God had turned away. He replayed his life in his mind over and over, searching for the exact moment he had crossed an invisible line. The loss of his son became evidence in a case he was building against himself. His behavior shifted again. Prince grew more rigid about morality, but it didn't bring him peace. He swung between extreme self-control and emotional collapse. Some days he seemed calm, almost serene. Other days he was distant, brittle, unreachable. Staff noticed mood swings that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with exhaustion. Creatively, he never stopped. The output never slowed. But collaborators say the work felt heavier. Songs circled themes of judgment, redemption, isolation. Sessions stretched deep into the night. It was as if he was trying to outrun his own thoughts by drowning them in constant creation. The studio became both sanctuary and prison. Behind closed doors, his body began to fail him. Prince spoke more often about pain, chronic, relentless pain, especially in his hips and legs. Publicly, he brushed it off, consistent with his long-standing distrust of doctors and hospitals. Privately, those close to him say the pain was constant and getting worse. He paced, shifted his weight when he stood, pushed through rehearsals that left him visibly strained. The contradiction was brutal. Prince avoided medical intervention out of belief and fear. But pain doesn't negotiate. According to people around him, that tension slowly pushed him toward prescription medication. First as a last resort, then as survival. He framed the pills as tools, temporary, controlled, something he would let go of as soon as the pain eased. But the pain did not ease. The pain escalated, and control erodes slowly long before anyone notices it's gone. By the late 2000s, his mobility had declined. People noticed him struggling with steps, with standing too long, with the physical demands that used to be second nature. Surgery and aggressive treatment remained ideas he resisted. The medication increased. Friends saw the changes: swings in energy, periods of intense focus, followed by withdrawal, flashes of confusion, followed by razor-sharp clarity, then exhaustion. Behind the scenes, dependency deepened, not as some wild party habit, but as a quiet, desperate attempt to function. Prince wasn't flaunting anything. He was hiding it. In 2010, reports surfaced that he had undergone hip surgery. Whatever the exact details, insiders saw it as an admission. The pain was no longer something he could simply power through. Even then, recovery was complicated. He returned to the stage too quickly. The body wasn't ready. The medication stayed. As the years pressed on, his world narrowed further. Paisley Park became the center of everything, a fortress and a cage. He spent more and more time inside, surrounded by a shrinking circle of staff and confidants. Communication with the outside world was filtered. Access was rationed. Faith made everything more complicated. Prince didn't see medication as just a medical issue. To him, it was also moral-spiritual. According to Chaka, he talked about his pain like a test, something he was meant to endure, something that had a lesson hidden inside it. That belief trapped him between impossible choices. He couldn't stop performing without feeling like he had failed his calling. He couldn't fully surrender to medical care without feeling like he had betrayed his faith. He couldn't stop the medication without collapsing. It was a contradiction he could not solve, and contradictions like that have a way of turning lethal. In April 2016, that private struggle briefly broke the surface. After a concert in Atlanta, Prince's plane made an emergency landing in Illinois. He was rushed to a hospital and treated for a serious medical issue linked to powerful pain medication. He was released the same day. Those hours should have changed everything. They didn't. He returned to Paisley Park, returned to isolation, returned to the system he had built, one that kept him safe from prying eyes, but also kept real intervention at a distance. Days later, he was gone. In the aftermath, investigators uncovered what Prince had spent years trying to manage in silence. Tests revealed extremely high levels of a powerful opioid in his system. The public was stunned. For those who had watched the slow decline, it was a brutal confirmation of what they had feared. Prince had been living inside a crushing contradiction: faith versus pain, control versus necessity. He had tried to carry it alone. According to Chaka, he talked about his suffering like it was something he was meant to endure, like it was part of a test he couldn't afford to fail. That belief didn't save him. It trapped him. Between the fear of surrender and the fear of stopping, between the need for relief and the terror of what that relief meant. By the end, the contradiction wasn't just philosophical. It was deadly. By 2014, Prince had almost completely disappeared from the world he once dominated so easily. Paisley Park, which had started as a creative playground, turned into something else: a sealed environment, controlled, filtered, guarded. Doors that were once open stayed closed. People who used to come and go now needed permission layers of it. Those allowed inside described a silence that didn't feel accidental. It felt engineered. Prince spent most of his time within those walls. Days blurred into one another. Rehearsals were shorter meetings, tighter conversations, brief and functional. He didn't linger. He didn't hang out. Staff say he often moved alone through the building, head down, conserving energy, avoiding long eye contact. The pain was obvious. So was the isolation. By 2015, his inner circle had shrunk to a handful of people. Even they were kept at a distance they couldn't always explain. He stopped going to events he once loved. Public appearances became rare and carefully choreographed: a brief arrival, a quick smile, a flash of charisma, then back into the shadows. Attempts to intervene never truly broke through. Several people later admitted they felt something was wrong, but didn't know how to cross the boundaries he'd built. They were afraid of being pushed out completely. Prince resisted concern. He resisted advice. To him, concern sounded like judgment, and judgment by then felt like a trigger. Chaka would later say that, during these years, Prince didn't talk like a man planning the future. He talked like a man pacing his way through something. He spoke less about what was next and more about getting through what he didn't always say. The tone wasn't theatrical. It was resigned, like someone counting days rather than designing them. On April 7, 2016, Prince walked onto the stage at the Fox Theater in Atlanta. Witnesses noticed immediately that something was different. He looked thinner, more fragile. His movements were smaller, more careful. He paused more often. But he still finished the show. The lights went down. The applause rose. For the audience, it was another night with a legend. For Prince, it was a warning his body was trying to deliver. The next day, April 8, his private jet made an emergency landing in Illinois. He was found unresponsive on board and rushed to a hospital. There, according to reports, he was treated for a medical emergency linked to powerful pain medication. He was stabilized. Then he was released. Those few hours should have rewired everything. They did not. He returned to Paisley Park. No long-term hospital stay. No fully enforced treatment plan. Whatever warnings were given by medical staff did not turn into a lasting change in his routine. He went back to the same pattern: limited movement, borrowed privacy, and the medication he increasingly depended on to function. The days that followed were quiet. On April 21, 2016, Prince was found alone and unresponsive in an elevator at Paisley Park. Emergency responders arrived, but by the time they reached him, it was too late. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The building that had once protected his secrets now held the final evidence of his collapse. In the weeks and months after investigators assembled the truth, he had spent years trying to hold together in the dark. Test results revealed extremely high levels of a powerful synthetic opioid in his system, far beyond what the body could survive. The dosage, experts said, wasn't casual. It was catastrophic. The public reeled. This wasn't the image they had of Prince: disciplined, precise, controlled. But it was the reality he had been navigating privately for years. For those who knew him best, the findings didn't rewrite the story. They confirmed it. Prince had been living inside an unbearable equation: faith versus pain, control versus dependence. Every choice felt like betrayal of his beliefs, of his body, of the version of himself he thought he was supposed to be. Chaka later explained that what destroyed him wasn't just physical suffering. It was spiritual exhaustion. She said Prince no longer believed he was truly forgiven by the church, by God, or by himself. That belief shaped everything: his isolation, his secrecy, his refusal to accept help he desperately needed. When she said what he went through was worse than death, she wasn't talking about the final day. She was talking about living without grace. Prince woke up each morning convinced he was paying a bill that never cleared. Success didn't feel like a gift. It felt like evidence that he owed more. Discipline stopped feeling like strength and started feeling like punishment. Pain turned into confirmation that he deserved to hurt. Help looked like weakness. Vulnerability looked like failure. He wasn't waiting to die. He was waiting to endure whatever he believed he had earned. This is where the idea of a curse finally takes its clearest form, not as something supernatural but as something psychological. The curse was not a spell. It wasn't fate. It was guilt without relief, faith without forgiveness, fame without refuge. Prince walked away from institutional religion, but he never replaced it with a belief system that allowed mercy. In that empty space, shame grew unchecked. It rewrote how he saw himself, how he read other people's actions, how he interpreted every loss, every ache, every failure. By the end, he trusted almost no one. He carried his pain in secret. He medicated quietly. He isolated on purpose. The walls he built to protect his soul also locked out the very people who might have pulled him back from the edge. There were no televised breakdowns, no staged confessions, no dramatic last-minute redemption arc. The collapse happened exactly the way he had spent his final years, quietly behind closed doors. The tragedy isn't simply that Prince died. The deeper tragedy is that he believed suffering was necessary. If there was a curse, it was the cost of unresolved faith, the price of guilt that never found a place to land. The weight of thinking pain had to be carried to earn forgiveness, while never fully believing forgiveness would come. Prince never lost his genius. He never lost his ability. What he lost was his spiritual anchor. He stepped away from the only system that once gave him a language for grace, and never found another that let him rest. And when the pain finally became too much, there was no structure left that he trusted enough to catch him. His story doesn't just force us to ask what fame does to a person. It forces a different question. What happens when faith turns into guilt and guilt hardens into isolation? Was Prince cursed, or was he slowly undone by spiritual loneliness the world around him never truly saw? What do you believe? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments.